Thanks, Kevin. Thank you. Well, evening, everybody. Good to see you again. We are on week 5, and having looked last week at the partition of Irish Unionists, we want this evening to look at the partition of Irish Nationalists. But today is an historic day and occasion, I suppose, because it was today, 100 years ago, that the Northern Ireland Parliament was opened for the first time by King George V, who came to Belfast. There had been an election on the 24th of May. The members of Parliament who turned up for the opening were exclusively the Unionists, and the speech that the King made is one that has had resonance and has been repeated and quoted often, and some even feel that when the Queen came to Dublin 10 years ago, and her speech then had echoes in a way of King George, her grandfather's speech in 1921. It talked about forbearance and conciliation and stretching out the hand of friendship. It indicated, I suppose, in many ways that even this Parliament was maybe not meant to be permanent, that there would be conciliation, there would be some kind of reconciliation. It was also an appeal, it seems, to bring an end to the War of Independence that was raging at that time. And in a sense, it did make a significant contribution to that peace process, because in July, a truce was reached. Now, the peace that was meant to follow, that opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament, obviously did not follow, and the next 100 years have been troublesome, I suppose, from time to time. Violence has broken out, and the King's hope for forbearance and conciliation and to forgive and to forget and to put the past behind, well, that has not in many ways happened. But let's look at what happened during those years when that Parliament opened. There were 2 years there where the violence was intense in Belfast, and we'll look at that this evening. I suppose it's significant in a way that in both Southern and Northern Ireland, the defence forces, or the freedom fighters, whatever way you look at them, became the core of the police and military forces to defend the new states. Whether it was the IRA or the Ulster Volunteer Force, they were, each of them in their own way, fanatical nationalists, not terribly democratic. The UVF became the specials, especially the B specials, 48,000 of them, while the IRA became the new security forces of the southern state. Robert Lynch has said that the fact that both states were formed by insurrectionary movements left a dangerous ambiguity between the need to create conformity to the new regime and a culture of anti-state activity fired by the unrealistic idealism of the revolutionary leadership of both states. Violence had become hardwired into the state-building project. Well, now the nationalist minority, partitioned from the rest of their nationalist citizens in Ireland, were to suffer most in Northern Ireland from the hardwired violence of the birth and the state-building project of the new Northern Ireland. So let's look a little more closely at the Belfast violence. During the early part of the War of Independence, which began in January 1919, the Sixth County area was the quietest part of Ireland. From 1920 to 1922, it became the most violent place. The per capita death rate was higher than the most violent counties of Munster. The violence of Cork and West Cork has received a great deal of historical attention, but the Belfast violence and the related violence of Lisburn and Dromore have received much less historical attention. Maybe the Unionist narrative of the past may want to edit out the Northern nationalist narrative, but it was the nationalist experience. It was how nationalists experienced the setting up of Northern Ireland, the effect of partition, and a real part of what it meant to be on the wrong side of a border. The violence in Belfast was obviously urban rioting. Almost 80% of the victims were civilians, as opposed to members of the IRA or the security forces or the UVF. The killing had begun with the sectarian riots in Derry following the June council elections of 1920. A revitalised Ulster volunteer force, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and small numbers of Irish volunteers confronted each other in Derry. An attack was launched on the Bogside, and 15 Catholics and 4 Protestants died. The British Army intervened, but during the rest of the summer of 1920, there were outbreaks of violence in Banbridge, Drumore, Newtownards. The North East was to see the pattern of violence repeated over the next 2 years. Partition was confused and confusing, and there was growing insecurity. And all that erupted in brutal violence in Belfast. The IRA had killed a Royal Irish Constabulary Division Commissioner, Gerard Smith, in Cork. His body was brought back to his hometown of Banbridge for burial on the 21st of July. It was a day in which workers were due to return after the 12th of July holidays. 10,000 Orangemen lined the streets, and there were attacks on Catholic property in Banbridge and nearby Drumore. On the 27th of August, only a few days later, an RIC district inspector, Oswald Swansea, was shot dead by IRA members from Cork. Now, Swansea had been implicated in the murder of Thomas McCartan, the Sinn Féin mayor of Cork. And they had moved Swansea out of Cork with security forces and authorities, but he had been tracked to his hometown of Lisburn. And at 1 p.m. on the 22nd of August, he was shot dead as he left Sunday service in Lisburn Cathedral. Loyalist mobs then set loose on the Catholic population of Lisburn, looting and burning, and most of Lisburn's Catholic minority fled to Belfast, and Newry and Dundalk. Some 200 families, roughly 1,000 people, left Lisburn in 48 hours. In Lisburn, 300 Catholic homes, religious buildings, the local convent, and Catholic businesses were destroyed. Fred Crawford, the architect of the 1914 UVF gun running, surveyed the scene and acknowledged that, quote, there certainly are practically no shops or businesses left to the Roman Catholics. That was after he admitted that it was no wonder the mob lost its head with fury after Swansea's murder. Only 7 men were arrested for that scene and destruction in Lisburn. 5 convicted and sentenced, and later acquitted. One of Swansea's assassins passing through Lisburn on his way back south by train saw Lisburn ablaze. He had been sent north by Michael Collins to kill Swansea. Workers returned to work on the 21st of July after the fortnight's holiday. The confused, confusing and insecure atmosphere had not been helped by extreme speeches made on 12th of July Orange platforms by unionists. On the day back to work, Protestant workers held lunchtime meetings in the Belfast shipyards. A boycott of 5,000 Catholic workers was called for. But a group of 600 workers decided to take things beyond a boycott. All Catholics were ordered to clear out, and those who refused were viciously attacked and beaten. Many jumped into the River Lagan to escape. Suspect prods, described as rotten prods, who were mainly trade union officials, and anyone with leftist politics were also expelled. The violence spread to engineering works and out onto the streets. Catholic workers were chased into the city centre. Soldiers were sent into action, but even they were overwhelmed. 4 days of rioting followed. Small Catholic enclaves, Short Strand and the markets suffered an orgy of burning and looting, and Catholics fled to West Belfast. Catholic churches were attacked, St Matthew's in the Short Strand and Clonard Monastery in West Belfast, where a Redemptorist brother was shot dead. In the 4 days, 19 died, 8 Protestants, 11 Catholics. Approximately 8,000 workers were expelled from their work, which was 10% of the Catholic population of Belfast. There were 3,000 homeless refugees. As Robert Lynch put it, Belfast was partitioning itself. And sporadically, this violence and killing was to continue until late 1922. March and April of 1922 saw some of the worst of sectarian killing. On the 24th of March 1922, a group of men, reportedly in police uniforms, broke into the home of wealthy Catholic publican Owen McMahon, a director of Glentoran Football Club in East Belfast. The male members of the family and the barman were lined up in the sitting room and shot dead. It was thought to be a reprisal for the killing of 2 specials the day before. No one was ever brought to justice for these murders, but a district inspector was rumoured to be involved with the murder squad. And significantly, DI J.W. Nixon was thought too extreme by Craig's Unionist government and was dismissed from the police in 1924. The Nationalist attitude towards the police was one of antagonism born of experience. Marianne Elliott describes some of that experience in this way: police raids on Catholic homes, singled out prayer books and religious objects for particular scorn, and Catholic members of the security forces often found themselves objects of attack. February 1922 saw some of the most vicious violence and killing. By mid-January, there had been something of a reduction of the violence, but in early February, 2 Catholics were shot dead by Loyalist gunmen. 50 in total were to die in February, 31 in 3 days. The IRA orchestrated a campaign along the Fermanagh and Tyrone border, kidnapping 52 Loyalists. This was related to the expected execution of 3 Derry prisoners and the detention by northern authorities of a group known as the Monaghan Footballers, who had been arrested by specials in Tyrone in January. The Belfast newsletter predicted retaliatory violence. And on Saturday, the 11th of February, 16 A specials were travelling by train from Newtownards to Enniskillen via Clones in County Monaghan. And the A specials had a half-hour stop at Clones to connect with an Enniskillen train. There was a gun battle in which the IRA leader and 4 specials were killed and a number of specials injured. Eamon Phoenix has described this incident as a match to a powder keg. And so it was. And over 30 people died in Belfast between the 12th and the 16th of February, 15 of them in one single day, February the 13th. 5 deaths occurred during the day, daylight, with violence intensifying during the evening with more killings. The most extreme bloodletting was in Weaver Street, a Catholic street surrounded by the mainly Loyalist Shore Road. Now, what made this such an appalling event was that it happened in a street where children were playing street games. And the fun of happy children was shattered when 2 Loyalists threw a bomb into the middle of the street of playing children. It exploded immediately. 4 children and 2 adults died, some on Weaver Street, some the next day, and the 2 adults within 2 weeks. 20 others, mostly children, were injured. There was outrage and shock, the bomb being one of the largest ever used in Belfast. Catholic Bishop McCrory pleaded for military reinforcements in a telegram Since Saturday, about a dozen Catholics shot dead, some in their own houses, and over 50 wounded, several, it is feared, fatally. No adequate protection here for Catholics, military urgently needed on the streets. There was absolutely no justification for the Weaver Street bomb. It was a deliberate attack on a street full of playing children, carried out quite knowingly. This was sectarian Belfast, in which Catholics and Protestants, mostly Catholics, were being killed. In those years, 1920-22, the provisional government in Dublin did not help matters by partially rearming the IRA and getting behind the boycott of Belfast goods and businesses. They were alarmed by the attacks on Catholics, but the arms and the boycott reinforced the Unionist sense of siege, and it led to the economic deterioration of both Catholics and Protestants. In 2 years, there were 453 deaths, 37 members of the security forces, 416 civilians, of which 257 were Catholics. And somewhere between 8,000 and 11,000 Catholics were expelled from the workplace, 23,000 expelled from homes, which was 25% of the Catholic population of Belfast. And there were 500 Catholic businesses destroyed. Now, there were also innocent Protestants who died in this violence, but given that, Catholics were 25% of the Belfast population. And Catholic deaths were not only numerically higher, but disproportionate among the deaths and the casualties. 60%, in fact. Marianne Elliott, in Catholic consciousness, it became known as the Belfast pogrom, and it left a terrible legacy of bitterness to the new state. Now, if the killings of Cork and West Cork were seen as reprisals for the killing of Catholics in Belfast, it is difficult not to see both killing fields as sectarian. Belfast did have the worst violence and killing of this period. Nationalists were not only on the wrong side of the border, their lives were seriously at risk. I want to stop there and see what conversation we can have, either about the event that happened this day 100 years ago in Belfast City Hall, but especially our response and reaction to the kind of violence that occurred in Belfast, why it occurred, what sparked that, what made it so brutal and vicious, and something that we hear now as quite shocking.
You mentioned Newtownards. What happened to Newtownards?
I'm not sure of the detail, but Newtownards and Banbridge and Dromore had violence, not on the same scale as Lisburn, and certainly not on the same scale as Belfast, but there were pockets wherever, and in a town like Newtownards, and it's still the case, there would have been quite a loyalist community, and there would have been a Catholic community as well, but loyalists would have been in the majority, and Newtownards has always been a kind of, at different times in history, a kind of flashpoint area. It became something of an area last Friday as well, in present goings on. But there were some outbreaks of violence there, as there were in Dromore and Lisburn. We better move on. Thanks, Patricia. Thank you. Want to begin the second half by looking briefly at what they called the Craig-Collins Pact. Now, Winston Churchill was very concerned by the sectarian violence that had erupted in January 1922 in Belfast, and which had left 16 people dead. And he believed that dialogue north and south was important, as was the position of Northern Catholics. And so James Craig, the first Prime Minister, responded to Churchill's letter to go into conference with Michael Collins, And on the 21st of January 1922, Craig and Collins met in London. And they did reach an agreement, or a pact. And there were three main points. Craig agreed to the proposed Boundary Commission not having the British appointed chair. Collins would call off the Belfast boycott, and Craig would facilitate the return of Catholic workmen. Second, a more suitable system than the Council of Ireland would be devised, Craig interestingly being open to holding joint cabinet meetings. And third, a further meeting would take up the question of political prisoners. Now, there were difficulties and there were divisions among Northern nationalists. The mayor of Derry, for example, welcomed the pact if it meant the North's acceptance of an All-Ireland Parliament, but not if it meant surrendering Derry to Northern Ireland. The border nationalists were alienated by the Craig-Collins Pact, and as were those expelled shipyard workers. Well, only 20 Catholic workers were reinstated from the 8,000 or 11,000 expelled, which led to Loyalist workers declaring that they would not, quote, work with papists. There was no agreement on the Boundary Commission clause, and by the 2nd of February 1922, the pact was dead. Meanwhile, the sectarian violence continued with greater ferocity. A group of Belfast Catholic businessmen presented Craig with a set of proposals to deal with the violence. That group consisted of supporters of Joe Devlin, the constitutional nationalist leader in Belfast. Craig also met with Bishop McCrory, and the drafted proposals became the basis of the second Craig-Collins Pact. But Devlin, McCrory and Collins all shared the view that peace could only come through the disbandment of the specials. Craig was not likely to agree to that. And so on the 29th of March 1922, a team from Dublin, Belfast and London met at the Colonial Office in London. The pact was signed on the 30th of March 1922. Clause 1 optimistically proclaimed that peace is today declared. Clause 2 stated the pledge of Dublin and Belfast to restore peace. Clause 3 was the most important, dealing with the reorganisation of the police, a mixed special police, it was described as, with enhanced Catholic recruits. And Clause 6, that IRA activity would cease in the 6 counties. Clause 7, that Irish unity and the Boundary Commission be considered again. And the final clause would see if political prisoners imprisoned for offences before the 30th of March might be released. Now, the pact, though generally supported by Northern nationalists, had a short life. There were extremist elements north and south, and on the day it was signed, there was also the final split in the IRA into pro and anti-treaty forces. And reform of the specials caused uproar among the extreme sections of unionism. The unionist business class was in favour, but the extremes were much too strong. Eamon Phoenix has described the general responses to both pacts. Whereas Catholics and nationalists had thought Collins had given too much away in January, unionists reckoned that Craig had been outwitted in March. The violence continued. Even on the day the pact was signed, a sectarian bomb attack on a Protestant family killed 2 children. The pact was dead when on the 1st and 2nd of March, there was what became known as the Arnon Street affair. As an act of retribution for the killing of a policeman, a reprisal party killed 5 Catholics just off Arnon Street. It had involved armed men and lorries, and pointed to police involvement. North-South relationships deteriorated. By the end of April, an additional 38 people had been killed in Belfast Collins wanted an inquiry into the Arnon Street affair, which Craig refused. Collins believed that if a peace policy were possible, it would depend on how Craig would respond to the demand for an inquiry, the release of prisoners, and the curbing of the Ulster Special Constabulary activities. By July 1922, sectarian violence had subsided, but all sections of nationalism, from the IRA, the Catholic Bishop McCrory, to the editor of the Irish News, in Eamon Phoenix's words, believing that the anti-Catholic violence in Belfast since the work expulsion in July 1920 was part of a concerted plan on the part of certain elements in the Unionist establishment with the aim of clearing out the nationalist minority from the city. So let's turn to look at the Northern nationalist experience of partition. The sectarian violence of 1920-1922 had a huge impact on Belfast Catholics and nationalists. It was experienced as a clearing out of the minority from the city. A quarter of the Catholic population, some 23,000, had fled their homes. And of the total fatalities of the Irish Revolution, 40% had actually died in Belfast. Given that most killed were Catholic, it is not surprising that there were high numbers of Catholics fleeing Belfast. It has been described as the flight of Belfast refugees. Almost 10,000 Northern Catholics were in Dublin by the spring of 1922. Thousands more had fled to Irish communities in Lancashire and Clydeside. Dundalk and Drogheda were said to be packed to overflowing with fugitive Catholics flying from the border disturbances and the horrors of Belfast. Joe Devlin spoke to 1,000 refugees in Govan in Glasgow in late 1922 and claimed that there were 20,000 fewer Catholics in Belfast than 5 years ago. Belfast Catholics in the main were Ireland's partition refugees. Now, partition produced southern Protestant refugees as well, but the average Catholic refugee was economically worse off, and in many cases did have to seek charity as well as refuge. Those who were left on the wrong side of the border experienced various forms of discrimination. Northern Ireland Catholics were 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed than Protestants. The new Northern Ireland had to create a new civil service, and by 1927, only 6% of senior grade posts were occupied by Catholics. What Catholics experienced in Belfast in 1920-22 has been described, as we saw earlier, as a pogrom, though this has been disputed by Unionists and by those who have examined events elsewhere when the word pogrom was invented. And these were the experiences of the Jews in Russia, where pogrom claimed the lives of women and children in very large numbers. The Belfast violence killed largely men, and there is no evidence that the Northern Ireland government, however discriminating it was behind a planned programme to eliminate Catholics. But what the violence of these years did do was to force large numbers of Catholics into crowded streets along the Falls Road. In one observation of the area, quote, "They were cowed and dispirited. They had seen riots and death, the burning of homes and business premises, the violent expulsion of their own from the shipyards and factories and building sites. They had stories of murder and cruelty, of the wild exploits of the Special Constabulary, the bigoted outbursts of political leaders." It is of some significance, I suppose, that Father John Hassan, a Catholic curate in Belfast who wrote the book Belfast Pogrom, did not blame ordinary Protestants for this. He acknowledged that they too had fled their homes. Now, partition not only divided Irish nationalists, it divided Northern nationalists. In the border area, nationalists supported Sinn Féin and did not recognise the new state of Northern Ireland. And for all that had been suffered in Belfast, the city nationalists supported the moderate Nationalist Party and were prepared to work with the new government. Joe Devlin, the Constitutional Nationalist Party leader, appears to have often been in conflict with some of the Catholic bishops, especially Bishop Henry of Down and Connor, who was bishop between 1885 and 1908. Sean McMahon, in his book Wee Joe, entitles the chapter dealing with the relationship between Bishop and Henry, Beating the Bishop. Well, Devlin's relationship was much better, it seemed, with Bishop Patrick O'Donnell of Raphoe, 1882 to 1922, and then O'Donnell, Archbishop of Armagh, from 1922 to 1927. O'Donnell was opposed to radical republicanism, supported the constitutional nationalist John Redmond, and was more open to accommodation with Unionists. Devlin turned often to O'Donnell. Devlin, a constitutional nationalist, was not helped by the later Bishop of Down and Connor, Joseph McCrory, 1915 to 1928, and then Archbishop of Armagh from 1928 to 45. McCrory supported Collins' non-recognition of the Northern State and also chose to work with Collins rather than Devlin. Marianne Elliott says this of that particular stance. In retrospect, she says, this very public association of Ulster Catholics with Sinn Féin was a disastrous misjudgment and was misrepresentative of the majority of Catholic opinion. The Unionist preoccupation with security led to a failure to recognise that Northern nationalists were more moderate than nationalists elsewhere in Ireland. The Unionist security mindset had been set for centuries, and the Catholic nationalist community was seen as disloyal. It was, though, a significant failure to realise the greater moderation of Northern nationalists and the potential there was to build a more cohesive community, and that potential and that opportunity was there. But even when they did take their seats, Unionists ignored nationalists in the Parliament. Devlin led an in-out kind of approach, abstentionism, then participation, and nationalists were not helped, and neither were Unionists, by James Craig's abolition of proportional representation, first in the council elections in 1922, and then in the general election of 1929. This was, in fact, to dismantle an important part of the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. Northern nationalists perhaps did become too dependent on the Catholic Church, consulting bishops before the formation of a new nationalist party in 1928. Bishop McCrory did his own thing, and when Primate of All Ireland, he urged Catholics not to accept the Northern State. However, he had to backtrack in order to keep control of Catholic education. He denounced partition and even went so far as to say that Protestants were not even part of the Church of Christ. Well, obviously, this was before the ecumenical era, and I suppose similar sentiments about the Catholic Church would have been heartily expressed by some Protestants. McCrory's stance on church and partition and his support for Collins would have simply reinforced Protestant distrust of Catholics and of their being disloyal, and therefore to be kept in their place. Dublin, though, was turning into a cold house for Northern nationalists. In October 1922, a nationalist delegation from Northern Ireland, including priests, solicitors, and local councillors, went to Dublin to meet members of the Free State government to ask for funds to counter Unionist propaganda. They returned empty-handed, having got very short shrift from the Minister of Home Affairs, Kevin O'Higgins. He told them that the only policy for the other part of Ireland, their part of Ireland, was the treaty, that as nationalists they lacked cohesion and they needed to go back north and do a great deal of hard work to improve their position. They got no more joy from Dublin than the delegation of Donegal Unionists had got from Carson in Belfast some years earlier. Dermot Ferreter has written The Washing of Southern Hands, could hardly have been more apparent. For Northern Nationalists, the attitude of Dublin was experienced. They described it as a callous betrayal. The Border Unionists had described their experience as betrayal. Now the Northern Nationalists were describing their experience as callous betrayal. But now there were two minorities in Ireland, each feeling betrayed. Two common elements united Northern Catholics, as Marianne Elliott again has put it. Institutional Catholicism defined their lives and their politics and suffused their entire identity. The second element, they knew that political Protestantism considered them inferior in every way, and the two were intertwined. And since it was for their religion that they were pilloried, there was pride in a strong Catholic Church and a publicly defiant commitment to it. In a sense, the Catholic Church became visibly representative of Northern Catholics, which made Protestants react in a sectarian manner. When Joe Devlin died in 1934, it looked to all intents and purposes the clergy were the leaders of the Catholic community. Again, all that did was to strengthen Protestant perceptions that there were sinister priestly influences over Catholic people. After the Boundary Commission, a shattering and disappointing non-event for many Catholic nationalists, a Boundary Commission that left the 1920 border as it was, it did seem beyond question, in Marianne Elliott's words, that Catholics in Northern Ireland had been abandoned. Well, let's go into groups. Kevin will put us into rooms at this stage. There is a question. You may want to look at it. You may find other questions that you want to look at. But could 100 years ago, at least maybe give this some thought, could 100 years ago have turned out differently? And why was there so much violence at that time?